Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 15531 in the name of Angela Constance on the Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill at Stage 1. I remind members that, as per Rule 11.3.1 (h) of Standing Orders, the question on this motion will be put immediately after the debate. I would invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the Request to Speak buttons, and I call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to speak to and to move the motion. Around 12 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start by addressing the issue of using Parliament's emergency procedure for this bill. Over the past year, I have set out the scale of the challenge our prison service faces due to the high population. Today, the prison population is 8,276, and it has been above 8,200 since September. The latest projections indicate the prison population will likely continue to increase, reaching critical levels. The population pressure directly impacts on staff and prisoners, as does the complexity of the population, including the need to keep some prisoners apart. High numbers of prisoners means that purposeful activity is greatly reduced, and it is more difficult to maintain relationships between prisoners and staff, both of which are absolutely crucial to ensuring safety and effective rehabilitation. There are also increasing challenges to the effective delivery of healthcare. We must bear in mind that the prison population is reflective of society generally, so we have an ageing population and a range of needs to be managed. Our prisons need to be safe, and that is a much harder job if the population is high. Therefore, we need to take sustainable action to reduce that population, which is what this bill aims to do. The changes being made by this bill are absolutely critical to relieve pressure on the prison estate and address the current crisis. The bill will support the Scottish Prison Service in maintaining safety and good order, so it can continue to accommodate those who pose the greatest risk of harm and support rehabilitation in order to reduce reoffending. Passing this bill on an emergency basis means the service can prepare and plan and implement changes agreed at pace. Presiding Officer, as I said in my parliamentary statement on 10th of October, the bill proposes changes in relation to the release point for some people serving short-term custodial sentences, which are those under 4 years. Currently, most short-term prisoners are released after they have served 50% of their sentence. The bill proposes to change that release point to after they have served 40% of their sentence. This change would not apply to those serving a sentence in whole or in part for sexual or domestic abuse offences. Of course I will, Ms. Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While domestic abuse offenders are exempt from the bill's provision, they are still able to be released halfway through their sentence. Earlier this week, we found out that a number of instances of domestic abuse reported cases to Police Scotland have risen by 3% from the year before. That's almost 64,000 cases in 1 year. Therefore, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary that if she can guarantee that her government will never extend these provisions to domestic abusers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I very much appreciate Ms Gozel's intervention. It is important that we all recognise the facts that domestic abuse, as reported to the police, has indeed increased 3% over the past year. It is now above pre-pandemic levels, and I can say to the member that in terms of this bill, I have no plans for this bill in any shape or form to apply to those who are serving a sentence for domestic abuse. Presiding Officer, yes? Martin Whitfield. I'm
very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary to take an intervention, and it's on a not dissimilar point, but unfortunately from the other end of the lens. Frequently, sentencing for sex offenders is increased because of the nature of the offence that they have committed. Is the government concerned in any way that by excluding them, there is potentially a human rights case saying that this group of prisoners are suffering a double punishment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Mr Whitfield raises important matters that, as with any legislation, you have to not just try and frame it to maximise its prospects of passing in this place. And it's absolutely vital that any legislation, particularly in relation to our criminal justice system or in relation to particular offenders, that it's proportionate, balanced, justifiable, and that we are not therefore increasing any risk of challenge at some point down the line, because that's not in the interests of what we're all trying to achieve, and it's most certainly not in the interests of victims. In terms of the exclusion of these categories of prisoners, in terms of sexual offenders and domestic abuse, this recognises the specific barriers to reporting of sexual and domestic abuse offences and the need to maintain confidence in the justice system. And given the historical underreporting of these offences and progress made in recent years to overcome this, it is critical that we continue to effectively recognise and prosecute these crimes in line with our overarching aim to tackle gender-based violence. Presiding Officer, the bill proposes this change for those currently serving short-term sentences and to all those sentenced in the future. These changes would apply to children sentenced to a period of detention in secure care of less than 4 years. Those currently serving short-term sentences will have their release dates recalculated and be released subject to the transitional provisions on that new date. Based on the most recent prison population projections, if implemented in early 2025, this would equate to between 260 and 390 individuals. This is approximately a 5% reduction in the sentence population, and unlike emergency release, this would be sustained, meaning the population will remain that much lower than it would have been without this change. Of course.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary taking an intervention. The Cabinet Secretary talked, understandably, about taking sustainable action, but in the early emergency release programme, something like 1 in 8 of the 477 released were very quickly back behind bars. What does our data show will be the return rate, if you like, of this release programme?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, Presiding Officer, it is correct to say that in terms of the information that we have thus far around the early release programme that commenced in July, that 57 of those 477 prisoners were returned, and that was relatively early into their release. That is not an uncommon pattern, particularly for people who are serving short-term sentences. We know that a proportion of them do return to custody, and that's why I have consistently championed community justice alternatives where they are appropriate, because they are robust and they do have more success in reducing re-offending. In terms of the future, I'm not aware of much by way of data that projects or gives us a crystal ball, but I understand the point that Mr Kerr makes. Presiding Officer, I've taken 3 interventions and I'm not halfway through, so please, if I have time, I'll accommodate you later. Presiding Officer, this new point of release is a proportionate change which we consider strikes an appropriate balance between sufficiently reducing the prison population, mitigating the immediate risks and ensuring that relevant individuals still serve a significant proportion of their sentence in custody. Presiding Officer, I am acutely aware that victims and their families will have concerns at this change, which is why we are already working closely with victim support organisations on key issues such as ensuring clear information is also available to victims. and this includes enabling partnership working and sharing of information between SPS and victim support organisations. Victims will continue to be able to receive information about the prisoner in their case via the Victim Notification Scheme or Victim Information Scheme if they are part of it. Victims who are not currently enrolled in either of these schemes can sign up at any point if they wish to do so, and I would encourage victims who wish to do so to enrol in the VNS or the VIS, as well as reach out to victim support organisations to enable access to information. Presiding Officer, let me just outline Section 3 of the Bill, which is an enhanced version of the current power that enables further changes to the point of release to be made by subordinate legislation. This will allow the policy of the short-term prisoner release to be kept under review and adapted to reflect current circumstances. This power also enables Scottish ministers to propose changes to the point of release for long-term prisoners on non-parole licence. This is the reinstatement of the power which applied before the changes made by the Prisoners Control and Release Act 2015. That Act meant that Scottish ministers' existing power to change reference to a proportion of sentence could no longer be used because the release point was changed to a fixed period of time, namely 6 months before the end of the prisoner's sentence. The taking of this power in relation to long-term prisoners is to support our intention to consider whether a better balance can be achieved between time spent in custody and time spent reintegrating within the community under licence conditions as part of a person's overall long-term sentence. As members will be aware, we conducted a public consultation exercise on proposals to change the point of long-term prisoner release earlier this year. While there was notable support for increasing the time that some long-term prisoners spend in the community as part of their sentence and recognition that this can improve reintegration and reduce reoffending, there were also concerns about the current ability of services to safely manage this group in the community. And in recognition of the potential risk profile of individuals serving long-term sentences, much more in-depth consideration is required to ensure sufficient resource is available to safely manage people and support rehabilitation in the community if any changes were made in the future. Presiding Officer, I have no plans to propose any changes in this area until such work is complete, but in the context of the rise in prison population, I want to ensure that as wide a range of options as possible is available should further action be required. Parliament, of course, would still have the opportunity to scrutinise any changes through the affirmative procedure for SSIs. Presiding Officer, there are also transitional provisions that have been made in the bill. I will, of course, return to those perhaps in my closing remarks. The bill will also result in some additional costs to local authorities and the Scottish Prison Service in particular, and I can confirm that funding will be available to support effective implementation, and there are also a number of consequential provisions that I will perhaps touch upon later as well, Presiding Officer. In addition to the proposals in the bill, we will continue to progress a range of actions to support sustainable reduction in the prison population. Secondary legislation will be brought forward to amend the use of home detention curfew with the intention of increasing the period of time individuals can spend on release under licence conditions. And to conclude, Presiding Officer, the provisions within this bill allow for a sustainable reduction in the prison population. This bill is vital to our overall response to managing the prison population. This needs to happen in order to keep the people who live and work in our prisons safe and maintain this vital part of our justice system. It is essential for public confidence in the justice system that prisons are able to accommodate those who pose the greatest risk to public safety. It is also essential that prisons are able to work with people to support rehabilitation, preventing future victimisation. And I move that the Parliament agree to the general principles of the Prisoners' Early Release Scotland Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I would remind members that those who are seeking to speak in the debate need to check that they have in fact pressed the request to speak button. And I now call on Liam Kerr to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, after 17 years of SNP government, our prisons are over capacity by about 260 inmates. Yet, what Phil Fairley of the Prison Officers Association called a perma-crisis was wholly predictable. I can actually remember saying to former Justice Secretary Humza Yousaf that increasing the number of imprisonable offences, especially without taking time to understand how they will impact in the real world, requires anticipating and properly planning for an increase to the number imprisoned. So I actually have a degree of sympathy with the Cabinet Secretary, having to address the inevitable outcomes of her predecessor's lack of planning and failure to deliver a proper holistic strategy, alongside their failure to deliver new prisons on time or on budget, or to properly fund or resource the justice ecosystem. But this bill and its principles are not the solution. Firstly, because it betrays that there is still no strategy, just reactive panic. You know, last summer, 477 prisoners were released early, but within weeks, a significant number had reoffended and were back inside. Around half of those within 20 days of release. Previously, when 348 prisoners were emergency released using COVID legislation, 250 were back inside by early this year. Now, last year, this Parliament passed a law to reduce the numbers remanded. In October, that was about 28% of the population, prison population. Yet there has been no formal assessment of the effectiveness of that legislation, despite ACC mayors warning that releasing prisoners due to a lack of space puts pressure on police ability to remand repeat offenders. And nor does this bill even attempt to address remand. And whilst the government does project an ongoing reduction of about 5% to the sentenced prison population, that's around 300 prisoners. It's hardly likely to address a population expected to reach 9,000 by the new year. 2 seconds, please. All of which is presumably why the Prisons Inspectorate warned that releasing these criminals may be insufficient to deal with the population crisis. Presiding Officer, I watched Dr Graham last night saying that this early release will not solve long-term underlying issues which have beset the system for decades. And she's right. Mr Whitfield.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Liam Kerr to give way. And on that very point, the Cabinet Secretary has just spoken about the confidence that's needed in the prison system. Hasn't the experiences we've had of the early release and the potential of this bill potentially undermine confidence in the whole justice system?
Liam Kerr.
Well, I think there's a very real risk of undermining of confidence in the justice system, but don't take my word for it, because we've had victim support organisations telling us all that that's exactly what could happen. And I think that undermining of confidence goes towards, in a second please, Audrey Nicholl, the comments that the Cabinet Secretary made yesterday on GMS when she said we need an immediate reduction in numbers. Fine, but the long-term prisoner provisions in this bill don't do that. They reduce the parliamentary scrutiny required should the government require to release that category. As the Cabinet Secretary told us, the Scottish Government already consulted on early release of long-term prisoners last summer, over 6 weeks rather than the usual 12, then shelved it in October due to concerns from victims of crime. So having that principle in there looks opportunistic and devious, and I cannot support it, and I think it goes towards the point Martin Whitfield is making.
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for giving way. I just want to go back to the point that he made with reference to Dr Hannah Graham's point that this particular process will not serve long-term underlying issues. Would the member agree that it has got to be part of a much wider long-term strategy, and the aim is not to fix the system?
Liam Kerr.
Actually, I definitely do agree. This has to be looked at holistically. That's exactly my point, and Audrey Nicholl's made that very well. My big concern is that this is a government that's been in place for 17 years now, and we don't yet have anything like that strategy, and it's certainly not in this bill. Because if we look at the principle, the other main principle of this bill, to automatically release prisoners sentenced to 4 years or less than halfway through their imprisonment, Victim support tell us it might be a legitimate threat to victims' personal safety. Wendy Sinclair-Gibbon, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, when asked whether there was a risk to public safety from prisoners being released early, said, yes, it does. Well, of course it could. ACC mayors warned those being freed before serving their full sentences would go back and start offending again. Short-term sentences such as these might be given for drugs, theft, violent offences, and given that on the first early release project over 40% had reoffended within 6 months, that's more victims, more crime and a revolving door back into the overcrowded prison system. There's another point though. I watched a former prisoner on STV last night pose the question, what are prisoners being released to, given, as he put it, the plans are not there? Well, firstly, in another piece of short-termist, unstrategised thinking, the Through Care service, which was suspended in July 2019, hasn't been replaced. Now, the new National Voluntary Through Care Partnership via the third sector will not be fully up and running until next year at the earliest. Would you mind doing it in closing, because I'm running out of time, please, Cabinet Secretary? And once prisoners are released, our brutally underfunded local councils will, according to COSLA, struggle to provide adequate support to individuals leaving or diverted from custody. Now, the Cabinet Secretary rightly highlighted yesterday that the prison population is increasingly complex, with more vulnerable people with complex needs and more elderly people. So it cannot make sense to automatically turf these people out without ensuring adequate provision once they get there. But the prison inspectorates say with concern that no additional resources have been allocated to assist community services to deal with a potential surge in demand when this is implemented. And the bill completely fails to consider rehabilitation or reintegration. Now, the Cabinet Secretary rightly responded to my intervention earlier by highlighting the return rate and the importance of support on the outside. But the financial memorandum says, including the various costs imposed on the prison service, as well as the NHS and the housing costs, this legislation will cost around £3.6 million. Will I have a bit of time? Thank you.
You will, Cabinet Secretary.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer, and of course to Mr Kerr. Can I just remind him what I actually said in my remarks, that the bill will result, and I acknowledge, some additional costs to local authorities and the Scottish Prison Service in particular, and I can confirm that funding will be available. And also, as a point of accuracy, there is already a national through care service in existence. What the new contract will do will expand those services. Liam Kerr.
And the new contract will be welcome, but it won't be up and running until early next year. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will concede. And on the £3.6 million, which is detailed in the financial memorandum, and I don't need to remind this Parliament about the challenges of our financial memorandums thus far, but £3.6 million, the SNP constantly plead poverty and underfund, historically have underfunded agencies within the justice system. And I cannot, in all conscience, vote for principles which need £3.6 million, which the government repeatedly tells us it simply doesn't have. Presiding Officer, I have sympathy with the Cabinet Secretary's predicament and the hospital pass that she's been given after 17 years of SNP mismanagement, in which they failed to produce new prisons, failed to reform community sentencing, failed to invest in technology such as alcohol monitoring tags, even rejecting an offer to build a wing at Kilmarnock by the previous incumbent. But I read her interesting interview in Holyrood magazine this week, and I actually think we find common cause in looking at the justice system holistically and addressing the prison population in a properly managed, long-term, carefully strategised way, much as Audrey Nicholl, I think, was alluding to earlier. But this bill is not that. And I cannot vote for a bill which potentially endangers the public, which grabs power from this Parliament to the executive over long-term prisoners, which fails our justice agencies, our hard-working prison staff and third sector organisations, whilst failing to deliver any meaningful strategy or solution, whether short, medium or long-term. And for that reason, I shall vote against the principles of this bill at decision time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call on Pauline McNeill to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Around 6 minutes. Mr McNeill.
This bill enacts a huge change in prison policy and it's been pushed through in emergency legislation. So we have no stage 1 report to read before we make our contributions. I do thank the Cabinet Secretary, who's always been excellent at keeping opposition members informed of the challenges that she faces. So I do accept that there's a crisis in our prison system in managing prison numbers. But public safety cannot be jeopardised. If we don't have the chance to scrutinise it, we might get it wrong. And can we really say that it is an emergency as such that the Parliament will be denied its proper scrutiny and how we deal with the release of prisoners? When I think of the emergency legislation that we have passed fairly recently, the Post Office, for example, I do not believe that it meets that criteria. Victim Support Scotland has expressed concerns about the fact that the bill proposes the same mechanisms to contact victims, and they call for the organisations to be allowed to be proactive in contacting victims, removing the onus on victims to identify themselves. But we don't have that opportunity to make those amendments. The policy for long-term prisoners changing to serving their full sentence minus 6 months was changed when Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister in 2016 by primary legislation. It does seem odd that we've been asked to potentially reverse this by secondary legislation. Now, the Parliament has been asked to agree that ministers will have the power to determine when long-term prisoners will be released and when, if they present a regulation to Parliament. As I said yesterday, we will not have the opportunity to amend it. It may be that we agree with some elements of the government's approach, but we will not have a say in the creation of the statutory instrument. It is the most objectionable aspect of the policy today, and it's why we will be opposing the Stage 1 tonight. I demand, as an elected member of this Parliament, came here to scrutinise, as a backbencher and a frontbench spokesperson, to have the right to have a say in how this power is exercised. Because even on the less controversial short-term prisoners, which I don't have in principle a huge concern about it, but as the Law Society said, that the exception of domestic abuse cases is arbitrary, and they gave the example of 2 offenders, one that's sentenced for domestic abuse, who will be excluded from the policy, double-counted, if you like, as my colleague Martin Whitfield mentioned. But it's a clear example of why there must need to be close scrutiny to make sure that the aspects of human rights law are going to be applied. I think we've got some time yet. Yes, I'll take it.
Thank the member for taking the intervention. Would the member acknowledge that from October last year until July of this year, the Conservative government released 10,000 prisoners 70 days early without any parliamentary scrutiny, and the current Labour government are doing exactly the same thing?
Polly McNeill.
Well, I'll say right now, if I was a member of the Westminster Parliament, I'd be arguing the same thing, which is that I should have the right to determine whether or not prisoners should be released at a different point. Because what we might be asked to do, we don't know whether the government will take the view that long-term prisoners should be released at halfway through, or 40%. Well, whatever they do decide, I will only get the chance to say yes or no to that. So if the Parliament passes the emergency legislation, I also genuinely think we're setting a precedence I'm not happy about, for the reasons that I've said. Because for every crisis that there is, and there are a number of crises in our society and under the devolved settlement, arguably, and this is going to set a different bar for emergency legislation. So that gives me cause for concern. In 2016, when the legislation was passed, some analysis was done to assess to what extent it would serve to swell our prisoner numbers, as it would clearly have added to the increase of numbers that we're seeing now. Will the bill work? Well, Labour are concerned, I think Liam Kerr spoke to this, as to whether or not we'll actually achieve what it's supposed to achieve. In May, there were 8,365 prisoners in Scotland, the highest number since 2012, and we know that during the emergency release over the summer, 477 prisoners were released. Since the emergency early release, prison population has returned to 8,300. But the Scottish Prison Service does not appear to think that the releases have worked. It said in its submission to the Criminal Justice Committee earlier this month The emergency release scheme agreed by the Scottish Parliament, which operated during June and July this year, provided some respite for our staff and partners, people in custody and our establishments, but unfortunately it was far briefer than we had hoped. And we have seen a consistent week-on-week rise in admissions to prisons across Scotland. So where is the evidence actually that this bill is going to have the effect that it's meant to have? The reoffending rate of prisoners with short-term sentences is extremely high. Some short-term sentences have reoffending rates of over 60%. So I think we're all agreed that there has to be a strategy accompanying any change to short-term prisoners, which once and for all seriously tackles reoffending rates. I give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in short, I say to Ms McNeill that I agree with the point of a longer-term strategy and have outlined a lot of that over numerous parliamentary statements. But we should not agree with me that I have repeatedly said that emergency release would only ever provide short-term respite. And I've also repeatedly said, would you agree, that this bill in itself, while necessary, is not the only measure that we must take.
I can't deny that the Cabinet Secretary has been consistent about that. But the point I'm making is we don't know whether taking these emergency powers will result in a long-term sustained reduction of the prison population. And I do acknowledge that one measure in itself is not going to make the contribution that perhaps we would all like to see. But there have been signs over the last 17 years, and in fact over the last 10 years, that there might have been changes in policy which would add to the prison population. So it is concerning that the work didn't start some time ago. I'll finish on this, Presiding Officer. I mean, overcrowding has been a serious concern for such a long time. In Berlin Prison, prisoners have been doubling up for a very long time. So it's not as if these problems were not known. We do have some sympathy with the Government's position. We do want to work with the Government because we all want to manage our prisons more effectively and we want to reduce reoffending rates. But tonight we are not going to accept this should be done by emergency measure, and therefore we will oppose stage 1 this evening.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Around 6 minutes, please, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I and the Scottish Greens recognise the need for this legislation and its emergency nature. When Andrew McClellan was Chief Inspector of Prisons nearly 20 years ago, he wrote of what he called the, and I quote, evils of overcrowding, including the risks of suicide and self-harm, increases in violence and the use of drugs, losses of rehabilitation programmes and family visits, as well as losses of exercise time, privacy, education and more. As he wrote, they don't just hurt the incarcerated individual, they make it significantly more likely that they will reoffend. That's deeply damaging for them and their families, for the prisons to which they return, and for the people and communities who bear the scars of the harms they cause. That analysis was described this year by HMIPS as disappointingly relevant. We know that resilience and tolerance in prisons are serious concerns, that staff are exhausted, unable to focus on supporting people or helping with rehabilitation because they are just too stretched getting the basics done. And with people sharing cells, tensions are running much higher than they should, making life in prison more stressful and more dangerous for everyone. There is a significant rise in the vulnerability of the prison population too, especially around mental health. The Scottish Prison Service has been creating good momentum around recovery, but that is so difficult to sustain when staff don't have the time they need to deal with underlying trauma. Prisons shouldn't be places where we warehouse people with mental health issues or with any other kind of need. So action must be taken quickly and urgently, but also wisely and for the long term, dealing with the causes as well as symptoms. And I'll come back to some of those points in my closing remarks. Yes.
Jamie Green.
I have to say I agree with much of what's been said in the first 2 minutes of this speech so far. We do have to take action. And yes, these warnings have been around for years, if not decades, of overcrowding and the fact that it could happen. But therefore, the solution to that is not to rush through emergency bills in just 2 days that don't address any of these long-term issues. Why is the Green Party supporting this approach to dealing with such a long-term problem?
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Jamie Green for that intervention, and I wish we weren't in this position. I really, really wish we weren't here now, but we are. And I'm not going to say, I'm not going to look prison officers in the face and say, oh, well, we're not going to do anything quickly. We've got the power to make a change that will affect their working environment in months. We should grasp that with both hands. On the 10th of October this year, when the Cabinet Secretary made her statement on the necessity for this bill, I asked her whether community justice, mental health and other services have the staff and resources they need to support people leaving prisons and the communities that receive them. This is still a central concern for me and my party, reflecting what we hear from those doing this work at the grassroots, including councils and the third sector. They welcome elements of this bill, but they are rightly anxious as to its implementation. Will there be sufficient support for those leaving prison to find appropriate housing, to arrange healthcare through GP registration and continuation of substance use programmes, to receive the help they need through the social security system? We have had something of a dry run. The releases... Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'm grateful. I wonder if Ms Chapman would be at least a little reassured that, given that I've already confirmed that funding will be made available, and that is principally in recognition that housing services, including the provision of temporary accommodation, represents the single most significant cost identified, and that these services are indeed absolutely critical to ensuring a successful transition back to the community.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, and yes, that does give me some reassurance, and I look forward to the conversations that I know we will have between now and February with each other, but also with those organisations that provide the support to make sure that those resources are used as effectively as they can be. Because we've had something of a dry run. The releases in June and July this year, though their effect on prison numbers was, of course, shockingly short-lived, at least gave us the opportunity to learn lessons, to identify areas that needed more attention, as well as those that worked well. And we've heard some discussion on that today already. I was very pleased to read in the submission by the Criminal Justice Voluntary Sector Forum that HMP Grampian in Peterhead was singled out for its good practice in pre-release multidisciplinary planning. I had the privilege of visiting HMP Grampian earlier this year and talking with the Governor, staff and with prisoners. There is really compassionate, sensitive and thoughtful work going on there in the difficult circumstances created by the current crisis. People leaving prison don't go out into a vacuum. They go back to families, sometimes to partners and children, to communities which may include people whom they have harmed, people who are anxious, fearful, uncertain of the future. The impacts of having a family member in prison are practical, financial, emotional and social. Those impacts don't end upon release, but they can change dramatically. Whatever our views of the criminal justice system, none of us wants to see children punished for the crimes of their parents or siblings. But in practice, that is still what happens. Better support can't take that away entirely, but it can make it so much easier. So along with the provisions of this bill, I urge the Government to have serious conversations, and I will join in those conversations to ensure we put in place real engagement with families, child impact assessments and clear, accessible and sensitive information for victims and survivors. And I do look forward to working with the Cabinet Secretary and members across the Chamber in developing new provisions for longer-term prisoner release as enabled by Section 3 of this bill. Those provisions must be effective and safe for people leaving prison, for their families, for survivors of harm and for the communities in which we all live. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. And I now call on Liam MacArthur to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Around 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start, like Pauline McNeill did, in recognising and thanking the Cabinet Secretary for the constructive and proactive engagement she's had with spokespeople across the Parliament. I think Liam Kerr fairly characterised the fact that she's been thrown a hospital pass. And before turning to the detail of the bill that we're considering today, I maybe reflect on why that hospital pass has been thrown, why we find ourselves in this position, in a position that feels an awful lot like Groundhog Day, given where we were shortly before the summer recess. The government's been warned for years that overcrowding in the prison system was a disaster waiting to happen. And I think Maggie Chapman has just very fairly and comprehensively articulated many of the impacts. The Minister for Parliamentary Business insisted in yesterday's short debate that the government has been taking action that will take time to have an effect, and that may well be true. Indeed, I recognise that that is the case, but it's also an argument that successive Justice Secretaries have been making for years. The benefit of being your party's Justice spokesperson over a prolonged, and unlike Mr Kerr, uninterrupted period is that you can compare and contrast what ministers say in order to get through the latest crisis or the latest emergency. And the fact remains, despite the assurances offered by Angela Constantine and her various predecessors, Scotland's prison population has continued to balloon. And Scotland's prisons find themselves at a tipping point. That was the stark warning earlier this year from Theresa Medhurst, the Chief Executive of SPS. And she was right to highlight the consequent risks to staff, to prisoners and ultimately to communities that I think every speaker that's spoken to date has acknowledged. The measures we're considering in this bill, by their very nature, and as the Justice Secretary acknowledges, are something of a short-term fix. They buy time, though, as we saw with the earlier release programme, and perhaps in keeping with a cost of living crisis, they certainly seem to buy you a lot less than they perhaps once might have done. But as I acknowledged in my brief contribution yesterday, we are where we are. Taking no immediate action doesn't seem to me to be an option. However, early release is a complex policy. It deserves thorough parliamentary scrutiny, not least to ensure effective safeguards and provisions are implemented to protect victims, communities and minimise reoffending. That's why, whether or not we accept the need for urgent action in the case for early release, the timetable which Parliament is being asked to carry out this work is wholly unhelpful. And I think Pauline McNeill made some very important points in that regard. It's also, I think, counterproductive, certainly in terms of building confidence among stakeholders and indeed the wider public about the way in which our justice system functions. And that confidence is already shaky. We've heard about the perhaps higher than expected rate of return of those released early in the summer, but also the capacity within the communities that are receiving prisoners back into their midst to deal with that in a way that I think gives, as I say, wider confidence. Certainly.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Liam MacArthur for taking intervention on that very point. And one of the challenges about the confidence that the communities have is as a result of the experience of the previous short-term releases, where it has not worked as satisfactorily, where they have feel excluded from information and knowledge. And indeed, the consequence of that is seen by the very high figures in the return straight back to the prison of certain members who were released at that time.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank Martin Whitfield for that, although I'm slightly suspicious that he's seen an early draft of my speech, because I was going to go on to say that organisations representing victims have pointed out that only 2% of victims were contacted under the mechanism used in the previous emergency release schemes, which required victims to proactively identify themselves. And despite that, the government appears to be proposing the use of the same mechanism again this time round. I don't think there will be many people watching this debate who would consider that to be an acceptable approach in terms of communications and awareness raising. And I think the public and victims would expect to see improvements made to this bill at stages 2 and 3 in relation to information sharing. And that's certainly something Scottish Liberal Democrats will expect to see and will vote for. But while I'm prepared to accept there is a case for treating provisions in relation to short-term prisoner release as an emergency, given the warnings we've heard from SPS, the Independent Inspector of Prisons and others, I'm not at all convinced of the case in relation to longer-term prisoners. Emergency measures must be in response to an emergency situation. The provisions in Section 3 would give ministers open-ended powers relating to both short and long-term prisoners, powers that could be exercised at any time with no limitation to emergency situations and subject to effectively a yes-no vote in Parliament. Future changes to early release that could in theory be even more fundamental and wide-ranging than the ones proposed in sections 1 and 2 could be made law with even less scrutiny than this bill is now receiving. The Minister for Parliamentary Business yesterday seemed to suggest that there was no difference in the level of scrutiny between primary and secondary legislation. As I would have pointed out had he taken my intervention, which was attempted, I think, on multiple occasions, there is a reason it's called subordinate legislation. The clue is in the name. Scottish Liberal Democrats do not accept, therefore, the case for these powers being granted in this bill. We will support efforts to remove them and will vote against any bill that contains them. Presiding Officer, I don't deny the urgency with which steps need to be taken to address the immediate problems arising from the overcrowding of our prison estate. However, we lock up a higher proportion of our population than almost any other Western democracy, and we do so despite the evidence that incarceration, particularly over short periods, is invariably counterproductive to delivering what has to be our collective shared objective of reducing reoffending and offending behaviour. What happens with this bill between now and stage 3? We need to see the government and indeed this Parliament get to grips with that wider crisis within our prison system, increasing support for community-based measures, including measures to tackle reoffending, and indeed driving down our remand population that is far, far, far too high. In the absence of that, and in light of the concerns I've raised this evening, we will be unable to support the bill at decision time this evening.
Thank you, Mr MacArthur. We will now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 6 minutes. I call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am pleased to speak in this very important debate at stage 1 of the Prisoners' Early Release Bill. And as already highlighted, the bill makes provision for a change to the automatic early release point for certain short-term prisoners and for ministers, if necessary, to make future changes to the release points for short and long-term prisoners. The provisions apply to adults and children, however, sex offenders and those convicted of domestic abuse offences will not be eligible. Do we want to have to put these measures in place if they are passed by Parliament? No. Are we the only part of the UK having to consider these measures? No. Recent years have indeed seen a fluctuating prison population, with a high point of almost 15,000 in 2011 to 12 to the current population of around 8,300. And over that time, our attitude towards offending and rehabilitation has changed significantly. And today, our prison estates seeks to provide appropriate punishment, but in an environment offering opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration. So as such, the current population is simply untenable. The underlying factors are well documented, they are complex and they are not straightforward to address. The last decade has also seen the average sentence length increase by 32%. So in response to the Criminal Justice Committee's recent call for evidence on the bill, the Scottish Prison Service highlighted the current prison population includes higher numbers of serious and organised crime groups, people with increased social care needs and changing risk profiles. The remand population, currently sitting at around 26%, is likewise complex, with many prisoners experiencing multiple and complex needs and, to a certain extent, displacing the important work to support the convicted population. I will.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the member for taking my intervention? Based on what she's just said, therefore, if people are serving longer sentences because of the nature of the crimes for which they were convicted, why do we want to let them out earlier? Where's the sense behind that?
Audrey Nicholl.
Well, I think that it's a complex question and there's a complex answer to it. I don't think we want to let people out earlier. I think there are a range of circumstances that put us in the position where this has to be considered. As such, if I can make some progress, such a complex population brings significant operational challenges, including the disruption to offender behaviour programmes, as I've spoken about, pre-release planning and reintegration. The detailed submission from the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research points out the importance of these offerings to reduce the risk of reoffending as only one part of the much wider work needed to support and enable rehabilitation and reintegration. And as Liam MacArthur highlighted yesterday in Chamber, and it's a point that chimed with me, early release is a legitimate way to address extraordinary circumstances. Now, while we understand the need for action, there are understandable concerns about public safety, particularly for victims. And in their briefing, Victim Support Scotland highlighted a number of concerns that I know members will reflect on as the bill moves to stage 3. Now, here there is an opportunity for further engagement to provide reassurance, not just with regard to survivors, but also for families impacted by early release. For short-term prisoners, if the bill is passed, it is anticipated around only 5%, or between 260 and 390 prisoners will be eligible for release. And this, again, the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research highlights the lack of evidence that such a change will have a significant adverse impact in terms of reoffending. Rather, evidence suggests that the risk of reoffending is much more likely to be affected by the condition in which people are released, which takes me back to the point that I've just been making, and the circumstances to which they are released. Now, on numbers, the previous Tory UK government released over 10,000 prisoners up to 70 days early, and the Labour government has likewise undertaken early release. And to date, that's seen over 13,000 prisoners released across England and Wales. I will.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful. Just on that point, after decades of devolution, with the Scottish system and the English justice systems moving in very different directions, isn't it somewhat ill-informed and, I dare say, facile to suggest that an approach which has worked elsewhere, or which could work elsewhere, could just be mapped onto the Scottish system?
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for his intervention. I'm not sure that was quite the point that I was making. I was simply I wasn't making a comparison, I was simply pointing that out, and I'm not really thinking about mapping of processes and policy. So what needs to be in place to support early release to enable us to reach a sustainable population? Now, we know the importance of effective through care. As the former governor of HMP Grampian told me, planning for release starts the day a person enters prison. Community justice services are essential in this regard, and following the Criminal Justice Committee budget scrutiny, I would ask the government to favourably consider community justice in terms of next year's budget provision. And I welcome the reassurance of funding confirmed earlier by the Cabinet Secretary with regard to this current process of early release. In terms of rehabilitation, this is not just about a person changing their behaviour, it's about meeting their basic needs, such as access to housing, employment and services around, for example, addiction and mental health. And as it stands, these services already exist, but they are under pressure and are supported by a workforce that I believe is absolutely committed to supporting the needs of their service users.
Nicholl, could you please bring your remarks to a close?
I will. So to conclude, I want to just reference some comments made by Catherine Mackey on community sentencing. A sentence served in the community, if well constructed, delivered and monitored, should be...
Ms Nicholl, I really do need you to bring your remarks to a close, please.
It should not be considered.
Could you please bring your remarks
option.
to a close? Thank you very much.
So I will support the bill at stage 1.
Thank you. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Mr Kerr.
I, first of all, want to pay a compliment to the speeches that we've heard from the Conservative and Labour front benches. I think Liam Kerr and Polly McNeill, between them, have really captured the essence of why this bill is such a really poor way of doing business. And I want to add to my concern about the fact that the SNP government decided just to publish it a couple of days ago, really. There's a reason why we have timetables and processes in this place, and it's intended that there should be proper legislative scrutiny. And it's just not happening, and this is not the first time in this session it's happened. This is an all too familiar attitude, I'm afraid, from this SNP-devolved government. You know, they've nearly been 18 years in power, and I'm afraid in this session in particular, they are continuing to display a casual contempt for the Scottish Parliament. And I trust that the people of Scotland are watching and taking note and will hold them to account in due process. But looking at the bill, it's clear why the SNP didn't really want this bill properly scrutinised, because at its core, it jeopardises public safety. And the reality is that the first duty of any government is public safety. And if there is any suggestion that we are diluting, diminishing or compromising public safety, then we need to oppose it. Now, the reality is that not everyone that's released from prison early reoffends, but there's a proportion that do. And I've been thinking about the numbers that have been offered by Liam Kerr and others in terms of the early returns that are being made to prison. And I've been thinking about our hard-pressed police officers. I mean, they are working to rule currently. Their senior officers are going home at 4 o'clock. This is just going to make life that much more difficult for our police officers in Scotland at a time when there are so many issues that they need to deal with. And frankly, looking at the images, recent images of inmates released, celebrating in the street outside the prison, toasting Sir Keir Starmer, pledging they're going to vote Labour for the rest of their lives and all the rest of that, frankly, it was not very edifying. And look at how many of them are already back in prison. And we've heard about the Scottish example. We should be learning from the experiences that we're having, not just making the same mistakes all over again. And I'm not unique in having entered politics in order to help make a better society of the one we live in, one where the hard-working and the law-abiding people thrive. But let's be sure, when public safety is compromised, prosperity is compromised. And it's, yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to Stephen Kerr to take the intervention and so quickly. Does he agree with me that one of the benefits of being able to learn from previous experiences is that we can improve the processes going forward, and that one of the challenges in this bill is a backward step to secondary legislation, which, for example, loses the Governor's veto on early release?
Stephen Kerr.
Martin Whitford's contribution is ever pertinent. You know, the reality is it's always the poorest and most vulnerable in our society that are hit hardest by these sorts of short-term thinking measures. They suffer the most from antisocial behaviour, from violence, from crime. Small businesses in the communities that we live in feel the brunt of theft. You know, we recently had the Scottish Retail Consortium in Parliament for a round table. My goodness me, the stories they had to tell about what's happening in their businesses, the shoplifting, the violence, the fact that perpetrators go scot-free, even though in some instances retail workers have been very badly hurt at work. This bill, and this is the biggest point I think, this bill will only further undermine the sense of public safety that, frankly, at the minute, the public are losing confidence in our justice system. And it's very serious. It will only deepen inequality, measures like this, and because the crime disproportionately affects the most vulnerable. And then there's the issue about the victims. Number of quotes from... Yes,
Rona Mackay.
Thank the member for taking the intervention. Did the member feel the same way when your government released 10,000 prisoners 70 days early?
Always through the chair. Stephen Kerr.
Absolutely. I think I cannot make it clear. I'm not in favour of early releases of prisoners, regardless of the colour of the government. Labour, Conservative, SNP. This is about public confidence in the criminal justice system. And we are getting into the realm of risking a collapse in that confidence. And in the time I've got left, and I don't have very much time left, I just want to talk about the whole nature of punishment. You know, you've got to see, members of this Parliament must see things from the point of view of the public. And the public are beginning to question the honesty of the sentencing policies we follow, for example. Victims and members of the public cannot understand why it is that prisoners are sentenced to so many years and then automatically get released. The reality is people are in prison for all kinds of different reasons. Some are there because they themselves have been failed at some point in their lives, but I think we're at risk of extending that failure to the way that people are about to be released, expeditiously. Some people are there because they've acted out of desperation, some have exercised poor judgment. And of course they must be held accountable for the harm they caused, and we can't simply write people off either. So we're talking about rehabilitation. And that really does tackle the root causes of crime, the illiteracy, the addiction, the broken relationships. But if we're going to break the cycle of offending, how does it help a prisoner to be released early when they're in mid-course of perhaps
Mr. Kerr, you will need to bring your remarks to a close, please.
I will. I just simply want to say that this bill fails on every measurement of any justice measure. It is unjust to victims, unjust to prisoners, unjust to society, unjust to everybody connected with the system, because the system is broken and these sort of short-term measures do not fix anything.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kerr. I now call Fulton McGregor to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me start with a point of consensus with opposition members. Of course, it's not ideal that this bill has been taken through on an emergency basis. I don't think anybody, the government or any government backbenchers, would have wanted that to be the case as well. But I believe, as has already been said, that it is necessary to do it this way due to the overcrowding of our prison estate, which has become unsafe for those in prison and for the staff who serve us there. And that is an unacceptable situation that we must act. I've just started, Mr Kerr, and I've got quite a lot to say. Our prison population is at a critical level despite actions such as presumption against short-term sentences and more of a focus on restorative justice and community-based sentencing. The prison population is also becoming increasingly complex, with more and more older inmates presenting with more and more complex health needs. With a backlog of court cases still presenting an issue and many prisoners being held in remand for extended periods of time, the prison estate is under increasing pressure. Sentence length has also been increasing, so some prisoners are being held for longer periods of time. It is the government's job to ensure the safe operation of prisons and put measures in place that aren't just short-term fixes but are sustainable. And that's why I believe this legislation is necessary also, because if brought in, it could result in a sustained reduction of around about 5% to the sentenced prison population. Apologies. Thought just now, Mr Kerr. I thought it was a helpful moment. The bill allows us to take measures that will benefit the prison population in the long term and will make levels of prisoners more sustainable. Those who are sentenced for domestic abuse or sexual offences will not be considered for early release, worth re-emphasising, and those who commit the most serious of crimes will not be considered. Also, as has already been articulated, those eligible for early release are prisoners who are already going to be considered for unconditional and automatic release at 50% of their sentences. This will amend it to 40%. And importantly, the reduction in prisoners would be maintained in terms of population. With these measures in place, there will always be less imprisoned than it would have been without this measure. Now, as others have said, we're not alone in implementing such changes. Indeed, in October 23, the Conservative UK Government released over 10,000 prisoners up to 70 days early, and the new Labour UK Government have taken further steps changing the rules around release so that prisoners serving standard determinant sentences will be released following 40% of their sentence rather than 50% as at present. And what I would say to that is important that these governments in other parts of the UK take steps to make sure that their prisons are safe for the staff and inmates there. Presiding Officer, it is, however, important that this bill, even in its emergency and fast-track form, ensures victims are at the heart of any changes. And I note the very good briefing from Victim Support Scotland yesterday. And I think it is vital that the Government consider the requests made in this. An important measure already in place is whereby victims of crime can receive information about the prisoner in their case via the Victims Notification Scheme or Victim Information Scheme. And this means that victims can receive information, including the prisoner's release date, and I believe that this is an important measure and step forward. For me, however, Presiding Officer, while it's very important we now debate the issue of early release of prisoners and prison safety over the next few days, I believe that we must also grasp the opportunity here to spark a wider debate on the whole justice system and how we can bring about real and lasting change in terms of the country we want to be. It will come as no surprise, as a previous criminal justice social worker, a bit like the Cabinet Secretary herself, that I believe that further and seismic investment in our community justice services could lead to radical change. There is so much good work going on, but with further funding coming from the punishment element of justice spending to the rehabilitative element, then there is more that can be done, and the judiciary and public confidence can increase as a result. And perhaps this bill can be the catalyst to allow us as a parliament and a nation to begin to shift that balance that every single party has spoke about at some point. And we must also start to tackle particular groups who are offending and making up the prison population. Young men really should be a key target group. Boys who later become young adults, often involved in low to medium level offending, in and out of court until community sentences are exhausted and courts feel there is no alternative to a prison sentence. Then they go on a cycle of in and out of prisons where their crimogenic needs often actually increase, ironically, as a result of being in prison. Working with young men earlier before their offending begins is really vital, and for that there needs to be investment in resources. Early intervention is key here. Youth work, I believe, can be particularly effective, and although not in the Cabinet Secretary or the Minister's portfolio directly, I would encourage the Government to think of community work as an effective preventative measure in the upcoming budget. We've also heard from other speakers about through care and the use of through care. I also think that is a very important measure that I think we could do more to invest in and involve organisations like the Wheatley Group, who do a fantastic job in working with people who are coming out of prison. And similarly, I feel that we need to do something to tackle the growing health and social care needs of the prison population, particularly observed amongst the older inmates, which is also a growing group. I feel we need to move to a more health-based and secure model, and perhaps something not dissimilar to the example of the State Hospital for people who have got mental health difficulties. Presiding Officer, there is of course more I can say on this issue, but I really do hope this emergency bill will lead to a greater focus on early intervention and rehabilitation, and through that we will naturally and gradually reduce our high prison population. I urge other members to support this bill today to ensure our justice system is suitable and continues to be sustainable, especially as we continue to recover. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Rhoda Grant, who is joining us remotely, to be followed by Rona Mackay. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Prisons are at breaking point, as we've heard this afternoon, and Scottish Labour warned that this would happen in the summer when early release was first granted. It was supposed to be a stopgap to buy the Scottish Government time to sort the cause of the problem, but they didn't do that, and we're now back where we started. Sadly, I think we'll be back again seeking further solutions before long. If a sheriff or a judge is passing sentence on someone they believe needs to be in prison for a period in order to keep the public safe and allow time for rehabilitation, then they'll do the maths and the sentence will be longer. Add to that the Scottish Government's own figures estimate that this bill will decrease the prison population by around 260 people. Prisons will still be overcrowded. What will the Scottish Government do then? Without dealing with the cause of the problem, the only thing they can do is release those that are serving much longer sentences earlier. This added to the lack of capacity in the police force to detect crime and bring criminals to justice will simply add to lawlessness. And we know the police no longer deal with petty crime. We see retail staff having to deal with violence and intimidation because the police simply do not have the resources to intervene. Now we are seeing those who commit crime serious enough to warrant investigation, prosecution and a custodial sentence let out early. And this can't go on. The Scottish Government has to act to make Scotland a safe place to live. In the Highlands and Islands, we have Porterfield Prison, a Victorian building which is absolutely unfit for purpose. We were promised a new prison in 2010, then told it would be completed by 2020, and now the expectation is that it may open in 2026. And this is one prison, but there are many more in the same situation, which is one of the causes for current overcrowding. But it also impacts on prisoners, their ability to be kept safe, to be rehabilitated, to access education and activities that can change their offending behaviour. And even when the new prison is built, it will have no facilities for women in the Highlands and Islands, forcing them to be held far away from their children and their families. And that not only adds to their punishment, but it also punishes their children as well. And if prisoners are released before the causes of their offending behaviour are addressed, they will reoffend, adding again to the problems. There is no deterrent and no rehabilitation, and therefore over 10% of those released early since the summer have reoffended already. And we also need to consider the impact on the victims of crime. Even non-violent crime can have life-changing impacts. People lose confidence. They feel unsafe everywhere. Yet hardly any of them were advised or even supported when those that caused the crime to them were released early this summer. And knowing that the person who harmed you is behind bars gives victims some breathing space and time to recover, believing that the perpetrator of the crime is under lock and key and they are safe from them. But when they see them in the street or hear that they've been released, that must be devastating for them. And the Scottish Government need to seriously consider how they support victims of crime and in this situation, and that needs resources. And Presiding Officer, this is a problem of the Scottish Government's own making, and this legislation is not going to fix it. They should have renewed the prison estate and need to plan to ensure that for the future. They also need to consider community payback orders. During COVID, many of these orders were reduced, which has meant that less are now being handed out due to a lack of confidence in the system. And when the Scottish Government were reducing the length of these orders, we suggested alternatives such as online learning, which could have been carried out during COVID, but that did not happen. There are some excellent community disposals that can turn around offending behaviour and divert people from crime, allowing them to live full and meaningful lives, contributing to their communities rather than spoiling them. But there are others that are not good, and they look like soft-touch justice. But worse than that, these failing disposals lead to a loss of confidence by the judiciary and therefore more custodial sentences. This legislation today won't deal with that, and instead we'll see longer custodial sentences being handed down, which will simply make the problem worse. Presiding Officer, this legislation is about public safety, and it should, more than anything else, need to be scrutinised. Instead, we have an emergency timetable that allows little or no input from the public, from victims and from stakeholders. If any legislation needed scrutiny, this does, and it's being bypassed. It's being forced through because the government has failed to get to grips with the situation, and sadly, what we are being asked to agree today will lead to a further extension of early release and the continued failure of the Scottish Government to keep the Scottish people safe due to their 17 years of neglect.
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Jamie Green. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are far too many people in our prisons. That's an indisputable fact. This year alone, the prison population in Scotland has been around 8,300, and that is worryingly high. The pressure on the prison estate is simply unsustainable, and the alarming trajectory shows no sign of stopping. We know that prisons are dangerous places. It's estimated that 8% of the prison population is an identified organised crime group member. Attacks on prison staff are soaring, and a high population always risks disorder in the prison estate. Presiding Officer, this is not legislation that the Government would have wanted to bring to the Chamber, but it is necessary and unavoidable. In common with England and Wales, we have reached crisis point when it comes to the rising prison population, and doing nothing is simply not an option. Prisons must be... Yes.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Rona Mackay to take an intervention. She talks about the percentage of the population that are connected to organised crime. Does she consider that perhaps a group like the sexual offenders should also be excluded for the early release because of the damage they do in their communities?
Rona Mackay.
Well, I think the exclusions have been made for very good and research reasons, so it's really not for me to make that judgment, I'm afraid. Prisons must be able to function safely for the sake of the prisoners and, crucially, the hard-working prison staff who do a more difficult job on a daily basis than I suspect any of us in this chamber could imagine. So, as we've heard, short-term prisoners, those serving sentences of less than 4 years, would have their automatic and unconditional release point changed from the current 50% of sentence served to 40% of their sentence. And the proposals would also apply to under-18s serving short-term under 4 years period of detention in secure care establishments, commencing February 2025. Crucially, the changes in this bill do not apply, as we've heard, to those serving sentences for sexual offences or domestic abuse offences or subject to non-harassment orders, and I believe that's absolutely correct. The unique nature of these offences would make it entirely unacceptable to do so. However, like Victim Support Scotland, I'm disappointed that stalking is not included in the list of exclusions, as it would be in England and Wales, where it's considered a form of domestic abuse. So what effect will this change have? It's estimated the prison population would reduce by around 5%, with around 260 to 390 prisoners being eligible for release. But make no mistake, long-term action is necessary to deliver a sustained reduction to the prison population and support for effective functioning of prisons. Presiding Officer, what is the point of prison? Of course, it's to protect the public and those that are a danger to themselves. But if rehabilitation and through care can't take place because of an overwhelming population, then in my view it's worthless and dangerous. Prisoners will be released at some time in their lives. It's what happens in prisons during the time they're incarcerated that really matters. Research shows that many people in the criminal justice system have experienced severe and multiple disadvantages, including homelessness, addiction, domestic violence and abuse. And far too many women are in prison or remand. And I agree with Rhoda Grant's comments to that effect and the terrible repercussions for families. So if no rehabilitation and preparation for liberty has been undertaken, we are releasing people who will return to prison eventually through the revolving door. I believe a focus on community-based interventions and sentences is much more effective in reducing reoffending than giving people short-term custodial sentences. And the stats back this up. The reconviction rate for those given community payback orders in 2018 to 2019 was 29.8% compared to 52.1% for those given custodial sentences of 1 year or less. And that's why the Scottish Government is investing £148 million on community justice this year, an increase of £14 million. Those released from a short-term sentence can access voluntary through care support either from third sector providers or the local authority. And through care services are vital. They provide a variety of supports, including assistance with accessing... Yes.
Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful, and the members understandably addressing the short-term sentence piece of this. But there is this long-term piece which won't actually have immediate effect because no one will get released pursuant to it. It's simply a power grab by the government. Surely she can see that that bit shouldn't be as part of this legislation.
Rona Mackay.
I most certainly don't think it's a power grab by the government, and you could say that it's future planning. I mean, it's taking the prison population as a whole, and I think that's what we need to do, and it's been done with very careful research and risk assessment. Through care services are vital. They provide a variety of supports with accessing health, mental health services, housing or benefits, employability support and just making positive links within the community. So the Scottish Government is working with public and third sector organisations to support prisoners in release, and we're fortunate to have such excellent third sector organisations in Scotland on whom we can rely. Presiding Officer, in an initiative of this kind, it's natural that concerns will arise from victims and their advocates. Of course it is. And the Scottish Government, as we've heard, is working with victim support organisations on key issues, such as ensuring clear information for victims through the Victims Notification Scheme and safety planning. Because the confidence in the safety of the community and victims is essential, and that's a priority. So I just want to finish with a quote from the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, who said, "We're not aware of empirical evidence in Scotland or internationally that this small change in the timing of release will have a significant adverse effect in terms of reoffending. Rather, the weight of criminological evidence suggests the risk of reoffending is much more likely to be affected by the condition in which the people are released and the circumstances to which they are released." So I think we're striking the right balance between recognising the concerns of victims and survivors.
Must ask you to conclude, Ms Mackay.
While ensuring that measures have a significant impact on the prison population. I urge you to pass the general principles of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jamie Green to be followed by Ben McPherson.
The Scottish Government's objective remains to end the policy of automatic early release completely as soon as we are able to. That was Nicola Sturgeon in April 2015. Now, back then, she was accused of bogus populist electioneering by some prominent QCs. But do you know what? Perhaps Nicola Sturgeon understood back then what today's government simply does not. And that is that the principles of fairness and trust in our justice system are underpinned by the public's perception of both. So when the public see politicians meddling in sentencing, when the public see offenders serving just 2/5 of their sentence, then in my view that trust can be eroded. And that is what we should be debating here today, the moral of the substance of the bill, not the why or the how or the technicality of it. What we're talking about here are the length of sentences and how much of them should be served before someone is automatically released. Now, the government wants us to believe, according to today's debate, that further automatic early release will answer an entirely different problem, which is that of prison overcrowding. But prison population is a byproduct of many other variables. It's the product of the sky-high remand population, which is caused by delays to trials. It's caused by the nature of crimes for which people are being convicted and therefore rightly incarcerated. It's the product of the population of reoffenders coming through the so-called revolving door that we often speak about. It's a byproduct of the dilapidated nature of the prison estate, which led to numerous HMIP reports describing the conditions as conditions worthy of a Dickens novel. And it's also the byproduct simply of this government's failure to build new capacity, knowing that it would be needed and knowing that it was coming. These are the reasons our jails are full. These are the reasons, not because of the length of sentences. And it is these reasons alone which must be dealt with first before coming here and asking for the power to reduce sentence lengths. Of course, yeah, we should all applaud the efforts of Police Scotland, for example, to bring in serious organised crime, bring them to task, send them to prison. We should all applaud the convictions of those horrific, historic sexual abuse cases. We should all take the credit collectively as a Parliament for the new laws which convict people for domestic abuse. But don't be shocked when prison numbers go up as a result of all these measures and successes. And anyway, what does early release achieve? I beg the question. Is it actually fair as a matter of principle? Does it reduce the prison population? Does it tackle the root causes of why people are sent to prison in the first place? No, and it doesn't. Now, look, my feelings on emergency legislation on matters like this are very well known. In my view, it simply makes a mockery of the Parliament and of the public consultation process that we rightly afford to lawmaking in this place. And why? Because it simply leaves no wriggle room to fix any anomalies or technical niggles in amendments, for example, in between stages. But I also question why we're using emergency legislation in the first place. And call me a cynic, But I think that the government knew this was coming and left it to the last minute. What exactly, Cabinet Secretary, is the emergency? What is the emergency? If the answer is our prisons are full, yes, they are. But we've known that for years. They've been getting full for years. Anyone who's sat on the Justice Committee or listened to HMIP or listened to Theresa Medhurst over the years will have known that prisons were filling up. We don't need emergency legislation to tackle that. We need a whole system approach to it. Ministers want us to believe that there's an impending emergency. We must resolve this in 2 days by making permanent changes to legislation, permanent changes to sentences, without addressing the issue of capacity in the first place. In my view, it is now victims who are paying the price. Victims must forfeit their rights of fairness in all of this. Nothing about this bill is short-term, and it is entirely disingenuous to suggest otherwise. Victim Support Scotland told us of the consequences of the last time we emptied our prisons. We're doing it all over again, except this time it's not a one-off emergency, it's not a one-off measure. This will become a permanent fixture of our justice system. Let me chuck this out there. I don't think that automatic early release, having spent 40% of your sentence, will actually work. I don't think it will rehabilitate people. I don't think it will treat the addictions or the mental health issues which many offenders present with. But more importantly, I don't think it will pass the fairness test. The real court of public opinion to which we are all elected, let's not forget. And I say that as somebody who's often accused as being at the more liberal end of my party. But how do we get from serving 100% of your sentence to 40%? And where does it end? A third? A fifth? Now, you can say I'm being ridiculous, but what's the point of sentences on paper if they're simply meaningless in practice? And that's the point that was made earlier. We must maintain confidence in sentencing, because there's nothing to stop a judge simply inflating the value of a sentence in the first place at the point at which it's given to achieve a sentence served that he believes is relative and proportionate to the crime of which that person is convicted. There's no evidence. We won't know. We don't know what they think. And can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, where is the Scottish Sentencing Council in all of this? Because that was supposed to be set up. It was set up by the SNP to implement what I quote back then as truth in sentencing. Well, there is no truth in sentencing in Scotland anymore. When did 4 years ever mean 4 years? We won't know what they think. We won't know what anyone thinks. We won't know what the Law Society thinks, or victims, or local authorities, or the police, or social justice. We won't know because we haven't asked, because we're having to pass all this in 2 days. Let me close simply by saying this, Presiding Officer, and I will make this pledge to anybody watching this debate. We will, of course, try and fix this bill, but I think it will pass anyway. And if we pass this bill and it creates a single victim of crime as a result, then I am sorry. I won't vote for it, but this Parliament will, and they should be sorry too.
Thank you, Mr Green. And I call Ben Macpherson, the final speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many colleagues, I feel no enthusiasm for speaking in this debate. This is not a situation I think that any of us wanted to be in. There have been some very powerful and meaningful contributions from across the Chamber, many of which have touched on the long-term issues that have brought us to this situation across the UK, not just here in Scotland. But others have also talked about the facts, the situations facing people in our prisons, both the staff and those serving sentences. The issue of overcrowding has consequences. It affects people's safety, those working and those serving a prison sentence. And anyone who has had people come to see them from those two different perspectives, people with relatives in prison and people who work in prison or who are connected to people who work in prison, will understand just how challenging and difficult and dangerous the situation is. So action is needed. The short-term situation we face is that the increasingly complex nature of the prison population has created additional pressures. The commendable action that's been taken to tackle organised crime has meant that there are more people now in our prisons serving longer sentences, and that has an effect on capacity. And as others have said in this debate, the fact that we have an older population creates additional pressures, let alone the challenge of the backlog of the Courts and Tribunal Service as a result of the the COVID pandemic. These are the realities of which we all face representing the people of Scotland. So there is a necessity to address the overcrowding issue in the short term. The bill is seeking to do that in good faith. And as it does, to me, there are two main considerations at a generic level that we need to consider. The first, of course, is victims. One of the worst things that can happen to anyone is to be a victim of organised crime, or for somebody close to you to be a victim of organised crime. Anyone who's been a representative in Parliament and has served people who've been a victim of crime or have been a victim of crime themselves will know how devastating and negatively that can affect people. It's obvious to say that. So it is absolutely right that victims get our focus through this process, but also thereafter. The government has spoken about the victim notification scheme, but I think it would be helpful in the rest of today's debate and the stages ahead if the Cabinet Secretary could just say more and seek to reassure further those victims and how the victim notification scheme will be proactively raised. There will be a proactive raising awareness of it. Briefly, yeah.
Stephen Kerr.
I'm grateful to Member Macpherson given he's given a thoughtful speech as usual, but can he imagine how victims feel when they hear that the perpetrator, who was incarcerated, is going to be released early because of something that this government, this Parliament has done? Imagine their feelings and their response to this situation.
Ben Macpherson.
As I hope I communicated earlier, when you're representing people who've been a victim of crime, it's one of the hardest things you do as a parliamentarian. And in all situations, as has been articulated, at the end of a sentence, that's going to be a really difficult situation for people who are victims of crime or are connected with people who are victims of crime. And that's why whatever further reassurance the government can give, I think that will make an important difference to those who are watching this process and may be affected by this process. The other area which others have touched on that's really important is reducing reoffending. And that, of course, is a complex area of public policy. There is a need for a holistic, tailored support to be in place for those who are released from prison. And the relevant support services need to be in place. This has to be part of our long-term collective goal of reducing reoffending, which should result in fewer victims. This, of course, has a statutory element and to make sure that there's enough resources for social workers and other statutory services that will be needed to support those who are released. And this is a general point in relation to this bill. And, of course, Community Justice Scotland and Social Work Scotland are pivotal to that. I know that there's an investment of £148 million for community justice in this year's budget, which was an increase of £14 million. But I would point the Government to the evidence that the Criminal Justice Committee heard on the 9th of October about what a difference additional investment could make, and I hope that this is included as part of the budget considerations. Lastly, I would want to say this. Others have mentioned it too. The role of the third sector in supporting people when they're released from prison and reducing reoffending cannot be underestimated. Organisations like Street Soccer Scotland, who are headquartered in my constituency, or Fresh Start, who provide people with items to help them in settling into temporary accommodation. These organisations make a remarkable difference to the people involved and to reducing reoffending. And I would want to see much greater focus on how we support the third sector and what additional resources can be provided to the third sector. They are our fifth emergency service. They do tremendous work, and with more resources, the effect that they can have is transformative. So there's a lot more I could say that others have about the wider questions about our justice system and about the comprehensive nature of it across all policy areas: education, health, housing. It's across the whole spectrum, and I hope at another point as a Parliament we can debate that, because the rule of law matters to us all.
Thank you. And we move to winding up speeches, and I call on Maggie Chapman. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I spoke in my opening speech about why this bill is needed, about the stresses under which the prison system, the staff, prisoners and families are all struggling. Jamie Green spoke of the various factors that contribute to the prison population. I don't think any of us here this afternoon disagree. One that he mentioned was the revolving door of reoffenders repeatedly being sent back to prison. Overcrowding increases the risk of recidivism. This bill is one element of a range of measures that must seek to help address that. But there are other things that we must also consider, things that won't be done by this bill, but which matter just as much, and I want to say a little bit about those now. The first is about prevention. We know what to do. It isn't a weird coincidence that such a large proportion of people in prison come from a small number of postcode areas. The experiences that lead many young people into the criminal justice system are the same as those that make them more likely to be victims of crime, more likely to suffer ill health, unemployment, substance abuse and early death. Why is child poverty such a fundamental concern for this Parliament? Because our hearts ache at the thought of children going cold and hungry and isolated? But also because we know what poverty can do to children as they pass from childhood into adolescence and adult life. We all make mistakes, but the mistakes of the poor are much more likely to be treated as crime, to be underpinned by trauma, to be met with dehumanisation, condemnation and vengeful rhetoric. The second is about the responses we make to these issues. All the evidence we have from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, from Scotland's own world-renowned criminologists, from research across the world, these all show that reducing our risk of harm isn't about locking people up for short periods. Yes, there are some people who are so damaged, so disconnected from social norms, that keeping them in secure care is, for now, our only option. But for most, incarceration is both unnecessary and counterproductive, hurting people, families and communities, entrenching patterns of crime across lives and generations. There are alternatives, and alternatives that work. This week, as well as being Prisons Week, is recognised as Restorative Justice Week. Restorative justice recognises that the problem of crime isn't about arbitrary rules being broken, but about harm being done to people, to communities, to nature, to trust, to well-being. It puts that harm at the centre of its response, listening to victims and survivors, meeting their needs, but also calling offenders to account, to acknowledge their responsibility and to make amends, involving the wider community in its processes of dialogue and transformation. It's not an easy option, and it's not for every situation, but done properly, it can lead to outcomes that are positive and, importantly, lasting. And the third is about resources. That means funding that is secure and adequate for public and third sector organisations to carry out their work in community justice, in social work, in health, education and research. Courts and prosecutors need to know that alternative pathways are going to be available, effective and acceptable to everyone involved. The voluntary sector needs funding that is fair so that they can, in turn, meet their fair work obligations, can take on staff and commitments in the assurance of long-term futures. And it means data that is collected, disaggregated and disseminated so that robust research can tell us more about what works and why. And while we have full prisons, they and the work that goes on within them need to be properly funded as well. One of the arguments put forward for the 2015 Act was that it would encourage prisoners to engage more with the parole board. But it was pointed out that there were already waiting lists for the kinds of programmes required to obtain parole, and they still are. The Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research notes that between April 2021 and March 2024, only 47 people have completed the Offending Behaviour Programme that addresses sexual offending, and that 384 people are on the waiting list for the programme targeting high-intensity violence. In its submission following the Cabinet Secretary's October statement, the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research wrote that, and I quote, "It will take political will, moral courage, resources and action on several fronts to achieve meaningful change." Given this afternoon's debate and the comments made from across the chamber, I believe that we do have the political will and that we can find the resources required. I also believe that this bill represents a small but significant part of that action needed, one of the several fronts needed to achieve meaningful change. Do we have the moral courage, though, to not only pass this bill, but ensure we deliver on all of those other fronts too? Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Martin Whitfield, up to 6 minutes.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. This has been a fascinating afternoon for a number of reasons with regard to this debate. I think if we go back to the fundamental of what this bill is proposing, it's proposing releasing people from prison earlier than an independent judiciary has said should be the sentence. And why do we remove the liberty of people? We do so to protect the public. We do so as a deterrence. We do so to rehabilitate. We also do so to punish. People have different views of how those four reasons should balance up with regard to sentencing, but I think the vast majority of people, certainly outside of this place, hold those four parts as to why we remove the liberty. Well, we don't remove the liberty, Presiding Officer. My apologies to you. It is an independent judiciary that does it. But with this bill in front of us today, as a number of members have said, people outside of this place looking in, people who are making an assessment as to the fairness of what happens, people who are making an assessment as to the justice, the confidence and their faith in a system will look to see that effectively the Scottish Government is seeking to reduce sentences, and in some cases quite considerably. I do not take pleasure in criticising this bill because I think, as a significant number of contributions have made clear this afternoon, this is a very complex situation that's occasioned by a number of different factors, some of which we don't fully appreciate or collect by way of data. But this complex situation is being resolved in a very simplistic way. A simple algorithm to release prisoners of less than 4 years, and a power to the Scottish Government to do something about prisoners who have been issued with a sentence of greater than 4 years. And there are a number of these matters that deeply, deeply concern me. And I'm going to pose, rather than congratulate, a number of contributions. And I have to say, I think all of the contributions have been heartfelt and there's great value in much of what's been said. But I have a number of questions for the Cabinet Secretary that I hope she is able to articulate some indication in her summing up of where the Scottish Government stands on this. The first is with regard to funding. And the Cabinet Secretary intervened to confirm that funding for the next group of release has been guaranteed. But because of the legislative nature of this bill, that if it passes, this will go forward. So can the Cabinet Secretary guarantee that the funding is there, going indefinitely forward, if this legislation and release is used? I want again to raise the really difficult position of the human rights over an offender who has had an enhanced sentence because of the sexual nature of the offence that they caused. And I listened very carefully to the Cabinet Secretary when she kindly let me intervene as to her explanation as to what the Scottish Government's defence would be should that matter be raised. I realise that time is tight here, and it's something that, if the opportunity arises, I want to return to, but I want to do it that way so that perhaps the Scottish Government can consider what their position would be should a sexual offender go to court under human rights legislation and seek the court's decision on whether or not they are being double punished because they are being excluded from an early release system that sits as part of primary legislation. I hear, I accept, and I actually very much empathise with the reason as to why sexual offenders should be locked up, why we should give people confidence to come forward, why we should give people support as they go through a system to bring someone who has reduced them to an appalling nature of being a victim, why that support should be there. But I am not sure that that is satisfactory in relation to an assertion as why we treat them differently. Why is it arbitrarily that group? And interestingly, in a short intervention, I thank Rona Mackay for it, about organised criminals. Again, were they considered to be excluded because of the very damaging nature they can render into their communities? Remand has been mentioned by a number of people this afternoon. The bill is entirely silent on it. It would seem to me, just looking at the statistics, that one of the reasons that the prison population has increased so much is because of those on remand. Is that not part of the Scottish Government's thinking on how to reduce the population that are in prison? To Rhoda Grant's, I think, very articulate contribution regarding the state of the prison in her area, and she left us with the very sobering question that if an individual is released before the causes of their offending have been dealt with, they will re-offend. And that has been raised again in a number of contributions this afternoon. With regard to long-term prisoners, my final question, and I will rest at this point, Presiding Officer, are the Scottish Government in any way minded to separate what is in essence two bills here? One seeking to solve an immediate problem, one seeking to solve a problem for the future, which even the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed today requires much more in-depth consideration of this group is needed before we can deal. If they can be separated, maybe there is a different resolution that can occur with the nature of this bill today. And I'm grateful for your patience, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call on Russell Finlay. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let's be clear about what this bill will do and look at the reasons why ministers say they need to take this action. They want to significantly and permanently reduce the amount of time criminals will serve in prison and the prison population. Ministers intend to allow most prisoners sentenced to less than 4 years to be set free after serving only 40% of their sentence. That means these criminals, many of whom have committed serious violent offences, will serve less than 5 months for every year imposed by a sheriff, or 146 days in prison for 365 days sentenced. This, I believe, makes a mockery of sentencing. Sheriffs take great care in imposing sentences. They do so in full possession of key information, yet it appears that ministers think they know better. This undermines judicial independence. Ministers are seeking to pass an emergency law that will override these judicial decisions at the stroke of a ministerial pen. A second aspect of the bill relates to most criminals serving sentences of 4 years and over. Ministers want us to give them the power to create an entirely new scheme to release these long-term prisoners early. They want Parliament to blindly grant them this power, and incredibly, they expect the public to trust them to make up new early release rules in private. I will.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you for giving way. Does the member agree, regardless of the difference of opinion we might have on the substance of the policy, but does the member agree that in 2015, when the Parliament passed primary legislation to substantially change the release point for long-term prisoners, that it seems extraordinary that the government could give itself powers that could go back to exactly the same position as pre-2016, but not argue that it's primary legislation and that its distinctive Scottish policy is quite different from the policy at Westminster?
Russell Finlay.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, my understanding of that parliamentary process, and it was before my time, is in its entirety from the lodging of the bill to its passage. It took the best part of 12 months. Right. But this government expects us to apply minimum parliamentary security and no meaningful debate, and then this will pass into law. As Pauline McNeill said in her own contribution early, this is perhaps the most objectionable aspect of this bill. Liam MacArthur also identified the risks this carries, and Stephen Kerr, with some untypical understatement, described it as a poor way of doing business. Put simply, almost every single prisoner in Scotland could be freed early at the behest of a future Justice Secretary. Now, we've already heard much of the usual stuff about whataboutery, but in no other UK jurisdiction do similar emergency powers permanently reduce sentencing. That's the crucial difference. These powers will be forever. And we've already seen what happens in previous SNP schemes, early release schemes. Victims were not told, with only around 2% being notified. And I agree with Fulton McGregor that this simply is not good enough. And many of those who were freed early, with painful inevitability, went on to commit more crimes in our communities. And Liam Kerr made this point very strongly indeed. So why do ministers want to pass a law that will cause more crime and suffering? They say the prisons are too full and conditions unsafe. Conditions that the SNP government have been entirely responsible for 17 years. This is the government that has failed to build new prisons on time and on budget. They failed to invest in meaningful community sentences that sheriffs can trust. They spent £6 million on free mobile phones for prisoners, which were then used to commit crime. They failed to explore alternative ways of keeping criminals locked up where they belong. And my suspicion is that they would rather seek creative ways to free prisoners than keeping them behind bars. Because this SNP government consistently pushes a weak justice agenda. We see it with the policy not to jail serious adult offenders aged under 26. We see it with the weakening of bail and remand laws, which tie the hands of sheriffs. We see it with the presumption against the passing of short prison sentences. Organisations like Victim Support Scotland see it every single day. Broken crime victims further traumatised by a system more interested in the rights of those who cause harm against them. Presiding Officer, the SNP say this bill will cost £3.6 million to implement. So why not instead use that money to ensure that sentences are served? This is the same government that rejected an offer to build a new wing at HMP Kilmarnock because of their ideological opposition to what was a very well-run private facility. Presiding Officer, I agree with Rona Mackay about the need for the bill to exclude those jailed for stalking from its scope, and I hope that she brings forward an amendment to fix this. And Ben McPherson identified the devastating impact of organised crime in victims, but this bill does not show any such concern. So to conclude, this should not be emergency legislation which curtails our ability to scrutinise and amend. When the government previously abolished automatic early release, the parliamentary process lasted around a year. 7 days is a joke and, I believe, disrespectful. Jamie Green nailed this as a phony emergency. What is certain is that this will result in more crime, it will risk public safety, it will permanently reduce the real length of most prison sentences of under 4 years imposed by sheriffs in the future. Criminals will be delighted, while victims will yet again be kept in the dark and disrespected. We cannot support this legislation. I would urge other parties to think hard about doing so. Public safety in Scotland's streets and public faith in Scottish justice are both on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. And I call on Angela Constance to wind up to 9 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Mr Findlay can, of course, wag his finger, do some political posturing, but I just have to be really blunt with Parliament, Presiding Officer. I'm a woman of 54 years of age. I've been in this place 17 years, and the only thing right now that I am interested in is keeping our communities and keeping our prisons safe. Because for me, not to bring forward measures, both for now and both for the long term, would be unconscionable. And I just won't play that political game. Saying that, Presiding Officer, there have been some very good contributions. I've not agreed with them all, but by and large, I think they've all been very thoughtful. And I acknowledge those who come from a different political and philosophical position, that they have frustrations with the, maybe later, they have frustrations with the system that has existed since the 1990s around remission. Right now, short-term prisoners in Scotland get released at the 50% point. Now, people can debate whether that is right or wrong. It has also been the case that since the 1990s, legislation brought forward by the then Conservative government, that courts do indeed sentence, and they're independent in doing that. And I, like all MSPs, am under a legal duty, due to an Act of Parliament passed in this place, have to respect and uphold the independence of the judiciary and the courts. But it has always been the case that once people are sentenced and imprisoned or given a community disposal, that the rules and regulations around, in this case, the release of prisoners has legitimately lay with ministers or indeed Parliament, of course.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. And it's on this point. I'd like to ask, if the Parliament was to agree next week to give you the power, particularly in relation to long-term prisoners, what's in the Cabinet Secretary's mind at the moment as to how to use that power? Will you change the the 6 months? Or what's on your mind at the moment as to how you might use that power? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
So, Presiding Officer, in the various statements that I've made to Parliament, there is at least 2 of those statements that I have always been really upfront that I think there is merit in re-looking at the release arrangements for long-term prisoners. You know, whether that is somewhere in between what we have now than what we had in the past. I think if people spend more time in custody, and we know that every cohort of prisoners are spending longer in custody because they've been given longer sentences. And we have to remember that your time on licence is still part of your sentence. So if you're spending more time in custody, should you not be spending more time being reintegrated? So that's the point that I've only ever pursued, is for it to be considered. And I don't necessarily want to get into the, kind of comparing parliaments, but I do note that, and I'm trying to actually make more of a pragmatic point than a political one, that in terms of the new Labour government, they have used a statutory instrument to move the release point for standard determinate sentence prisoners, some of whom are short-term and some of whom are long-term. And they've moved that dial from 50% to release at 40%. And all I'm saying is why not Scotland? I just sometimes think in this Parliament we try and make things even harder for ourselves. But of course, Presiding Officer, I will give some consideration to the points that have been made in and around what is rightly called subordinate legislation. Presiding Officer, other members have spoke of how our system of sentencing is not well understood, and that is a point that I absolutely accept. There's a role there for the Sentencing Council. There is a role there for ourselves also. But most people seem to have the frustration that Scotland continues to have one of the highest prison populations in Western Europe. And of course we can narrate why that is. And that is because, yes, our prosecutors and police are more successful now at pursuing historical sexual crimes. Yes, we are incarcerating more serious organised crime nominals, rightly so. But right now in our prisons, and this has to be the biggest difference that I notice in our system from when I worked in prisons, is we are also seeing increasing vulnerability in our prisons. And therefore, we have to go back and question who is prison for, what it's for, and how does prison best protect the public? And I'll take one more point of intervention, and it'll be from Mr Green.
Jamie Green.
So on that, is the solution to this problem that we reduce the remand population? The remand population is the reason our prisons are at capacity. If we reduce that, it would negate the need to reduce the sentence lengths that the Cabinet Secretary has asked us to support. Will she agree to that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I very much agree that the sustained remand population at 2,000 is way too high, and that is why I am currently investing in alternatives to remand. It's why I also introduced more than a year ago the bail and release bill, because we do need to implement a new bail test, because prison should be the preserve for those people where there is no safe alternative. And I respect that Mr Green and I on the bail and remand bill had some fundamental disagreements. Presiding Officer, this bill, in relation to the provisions for short-term prisoners, will give an immediate but also a sustained reduction in the prison population of around 5%. And that's 5% less than what it would otherwise be. So this isn't just a temporary measure, it is a very necessary measure. But neither is this bill the silver bullet. And over the past year or so, I have outlined the actions that I have taken, that I am taking, or I will take. And I have increased investments in both prisons and in community justice service. And we are seeing an increasing capacity in community justice social work and in parts of the third sector, and particularly around that shift away from temporary contracts to permanent contracts. And we see some positive moves in terms of that shifting the balance, with numbers of voluntary aftercare also increasing as well. But in the last, I'm getting the eye from the presiding officer. I do apologise to Mr Finlay, because he was gracious with his time with me. Presiding officer, in the last 17 years, despite the financial challenges, this government has brought forward a number of reforms. Whether it's the presumption against short-term sentences now being emulated south of the border, whether it's the introduction of community payback orders, which of course are on the increase, whether it's the expansion of electronic monitoring, whether it's the reform of home detention curfew, whether it's been the expansion of bail supervision, electronically monitored bail, the success that we have had with youth justice. And if there's one part of our prison population that is not increasing, that is the under-21s. We introduced the Bail and Release Act, the Children, Care and Justice Act, and the point that I wish to make, presiding officer, is that we introduced these reforms where they were, at best often resisted by opposition parties, or at worst that they were voted against. So if people are going to talk about medium-term solutions, long-term strategies, that's great, my door is open, but you need to have some solutions and some contributions to that long-term strategy that will see our communities safer. Presiding officer, and if I can just quickly add the point that Martin Whitfield raised about arbitrary detention. In terms of the context he raises that, I just wish to briefly assure him that that has been thoroughly explored. Where I am concerned about issues in and around arbitrary detention, with regret, is around the issue of a governor's veto, because a governor's veto can exist on a justifiable basis in terms of emergency early release, because of the pace and the discretionary nature of those provisions and decisions that are made in short order. That is not the same when you are changing the standard point of release for prisoners. It is a completely different situation. I would be happy to discuss and explore that further in slower time with Mr Whitfield. The other point is that we must improve the uptake of our victim notification scheme, and we always must also reform the victim notification scheme, and I am absolutely committed to that. That's why we have responded positively to the independent
must
review.
conclude, Cabinet Secretary.
We responded positively to the independent review, and will take an early opportunity with the Victims Witness and Justice Reform Bill to place in where legislation is required. We will take that opportunity. And my very final point, presiding officers, is that if our prisons become unsafe and unmanageable, there will be more victims inside our prisons and there will be more victims in our community. And please, by all means, critique the past, debate the future, but it's what we need to do right now. We will have to make further decisions over the next few days.
Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
That concludes the debate on the Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill at Stage 1, and we will now move to the question on the motion. And the question is that motion 15531, in the name of Angela Constance, on Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill at Stage 1, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.